I want you to imagine standing in a cold archive room with one of those photographs people usually glance at for 2 seconds and then move on from. Just another old image. Just another rich Southern family trying to look important in front of a camera. The kind of portrait that feels finished the moment you see it. But this one wasn't finished. Because if you looked long enough, really looked, there was a detail in that image that started to feel wrong. Not broken, not damaged, intentional. And once somebody finally noticed it, the whole photograph changed from a symbol of power into something much more dangerous. In the fall of 2022, a historian named Dr. Rebecca Hale was working through a backlog of uncatalogued materials at a private archive in Richmond, Virginia. Most of what crossed her table that week was exactly what you'd expect. Plantation ledgers, family Bibles, mourning cards, silver-framed portraits with cracked glass and faded labels, the usual paper trail of old wealth trying to preserve itself. Then an unmarked storage case turned up from an estate sale in Petersburg, and inside it was a daguerreotype dated 1858. At first glance, it looked ordinary for the period. A planter seated at the center, his wife beside him. 3 children posed stiff as carved dolls. 2 young boys in fitted jackets. A daughter in a pale dress that probably made standing still miserable. Behind them stood 5 enslaved people dressed in formal house clothing, arranged almost like furniture, there to signal refinement, status, control. That was the visual language of photographs like this. These images were never really about everybody in the frame. They were about ownership. Rebecca had seen enough of them to know the pattern by heart, but this one made her pause. A woman standing to the far right seemed slightly out of rhythm with everyone else. Her face was turned just enough to feel deliberate, not accidental. Her shoulders held a kind of tension the others didn't have. So Rebecca pulled the image closer under the lamp and raised her magnifier. That was when she saw it. In the woman's hand, partly hidden in the folds of her dark skirt, was a small folded slip of paper. Not a lace edge, not a photographic flaw. Paper. And I know that might sound tiny, almost laughably tiny, until you remember what a formal portrait meant in 1858. These sittings were controlled down to the inch. Who stood where mattered, whose hand showed mattered. Nothing random got left inside the frame, especially not in the hand of an enslaved woman standing behind the family. If that paper appeared in the picture, it was there because she wanted it there. Rebecca later said that was the moment the room changed for her. Same walls, same light, same photograph. But now it felt like somebody across more than a century had just leaned forward and said, "Look again." The photographer's stamp on the case identified the image as the work of Edwin Mercer, a traveling daguerreotypist known to have operated between Richmond, Petersburg, and the smaller towns around the James River in the late 1850s. A penciled note tucked behind the plate named the family as the Whitlocks of Cedar Grove, a tobacco estate outside Petersburg. Rebecca started where historians always start, with the dry bones of record-keeping, property lists, tax rolls, church membership records, agricultural reports. The Whitlocks turned up fast. Daniel Whitlock, planter, civic booster, donor to St. Paul's. His household, according to county records, included his wife Carolyn, 3 children, and dozens of enslaved workers spread between the fields and the main house. But in the slave schedule, as usual, the enslaved were reduced to numbers, ages, and valuations. No names, just inventory. That's one of the cruelest things about this kind of research. The people who mattered most to the story were almost always the ones the record tried hardest to erase. Still, Rebecca kept pushing. Rebecca next traveled north to Philadelphia to review Quaker correspondence and Underground Railroad records. She wasn't expecting a neat answer. Nobody gets neat answers in research like this. But buried in a letter from May 1859 was a line about a woman from the Virginia Tidewater who had recently come through after escaping from the Gulf South. The writer noted that the woman was educated, observant, and valuable beyond measure because she carried knowledge of planter households and inland contacts. Another note, written months later, mentioned a woman who wished to return southward, not for family reunion, but because she had unfinished duty among those yet bound. Unfinished duty. That phrase haunted Rebecca. If the woman in those letters was Lydia, then she had not only escaped sail into Louisiana. She had made her way into freedom networks and then chosen, unbelievably, to move back toward danger. Not because she wanted home in the sentimental sense, but because she wanted to help others get out. Back in Virginia, Rebecca arranged for multispectral imaging on the original daguerreotype. The technology had been developed for manuscripts, but it can do remarkable things with damaged visual surfaces, especially where texture and contrast hide details invisible to the eye. Watching those scans process, she later said, felt like waiting for a ghost to decide whether it wanted to speak. Slowly, the folded slip in Lydia's hand came into sharper definition. No one could recover complete words. That would have been too easy. But shapes emerged. Marks, lines, repeated symbols. One pattern looked strikingly like a small map with nodes or stops. Another resembled code marks used in documented escape communications. One symbol, a star-like figure near an intersection of lines, matched notations historians had seen in other clandestine route documents, usually meaning contact point or safe shelter. That was the moment Rebecca stopped saying maybe. She believed Lydia had carried a map, not a grand, dramatic manifesto. Something smarter than that. A working document. A route. Contact points. Possibly initials. Possibly houses. Possibly the kind of practical information that could mean the difference between being hunted down in a swamp or getting hidden before dawn. And then the boldest thought of all hit her. Lydia had placed it in the photograph on purpose. Think about the nerve that took. She was standing in a portrait designed to glorify the people who claimed to own her. The entire image was supposed to reinforce their power. And right there, inside their perfect little performance of plantation order, she inserted a hidden record of resistance. She put the truth in the frame. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough. Just visible. As if she understood that someday, if the plate survived and the right person cared enough to study it, someone would see what she had done. Rebecca kept tracing names, Richmond Free Black registries, church aid lists, arrest reports, abolitionist correspondence. Little by little, possible contacts surfaced. A carpenter, a seamstress, a boarding house keeper near the river, a drayman with suspiciously inconsistent work logs. None of them alone proved anything. Together, they formed a pattern, not chaos, a network. Then she found one more document, and this one felt almost unbearable to read. A Confederate intelligence memorandum from early 1861 referred to an escaped woman formerly sold from the Whitlock estate who was believed to be moving between Richmond and Petersburg, assisting runaways and conveying information to hostile elements. The language was furious. The writer complained of her unnatural cunning and dangerous influence among the Negro population. There was no reward notice attached, which likely meant the authorities had failed repeatedly to catch her. Years later, after Richmond fell, a Union camp record noted an interview with a black woman named Lydia, around 40 years old, who claimed to have aided numerous persons in securing passage away from Confederate territory. The clerk added a line that Rebecca never forgot. She appears possessed of uncommon intelligence and exact memory. That was it. No marble monument, no statue, no long obituary. Just that sentence from a tired military clerk who had probably written hundreds of names. And somehow, it said everything. Lydia had survived. She pulled other Mercer portraits from collections in Richmond and Williamsburg. In every one of them, the compositions followed the same rules. Hands empty, faces stiff. Servants posed as background evidence of wealth, nothing more. Not one other image showed a hidden object in a servant's hand. That mattered. It told her this was not some weird studio accident. It was an intrusion, a decision. Then came the first real crack in the wall. Inside a box of Whitlock family correspondence held in a regional museum, Rebecca found a letter dated September 1858 just weeks after the portrait had been taken. Daniel Whitlock wrote to a cousin in Charleston that disturbing notions had entered his house and that several servants had become restless in ways that cannot be tolerated. He mentioned increased supervision, restricted movement, the need to make an example before ideas spread. Ideas, that word sat on the page like a live ember. A few weeks later, Rebecca found a sale record. 3 enslaved women from the Whitlock household had been sold south in a hurried transaction at prices slightly below market value. That detail bothered her too. Slaveholders didn't like losing money. If he sold them quickly and cheaply, he likely wanted them gone for some reason more urgent than profit. So now the photograph had become something else. A hidden paper, a letter about dangerous ideas, a rushed sale. Rebecca needed names. She got them from the one place she almost didn't think to look, a descendant. Margaret Whitlock Avery was in her late 70s, living in an old brick row house in Richmond, surrounded by inherited furniture and the kind of family silence that settles over generations when nobody wants to say what they know. To her credit, she didn't flinch from the conversation. She told Rebecca that her grandfather had destroyed many of the Plantation-era photographs, and as a child she had once heard her grandmother mention a house girl named Lydia who had learned to read and caused trouble. That was the first name, Lydia. Margaret also produced a narrow diary that had belonged to Caroline Whitlock, the planter's wife. The entries were clipped and restrained, as if even private thoughts needed a corset. But in August 1858, on the day of the portrait sitting, Caroline wrote that Lydia had stood with a strange composure and had insisted on holding her own handkerchief, despite instructions from the photographer. A month later came another entry, colder this time. Daniel has removed Lydia, Esther, and Rose. He believes them infected by outside influence. I am relieved for the children, though unsettled in spirit. Outside influence, you start seeing the pattern, right? Rebecca did too. And once she had Lydia's name, she widened the search to historians who studied resistance networks among enslaved people in Virginia. One of them, Professor Isaiah Grant, took one look at the enhanced image of the paper and told her not to think small. He reminded her that 1858 was not some calm final chapter before the Civil War. Virginia was already vibrating with fear. Enslaved resistance, abolitionist literature, secret literacy circles, movement of free black sailors, Quaker aid networks, coded routes, whispered news from one county to the next. Slaveholders liked to pretend they controlled information. They didn't. News moved, messages moved, people moved when they could. And people who worked inside the main house often had access, others did not. That was the key. Lydia, if she was indeed a house servant, with permission to move through parlors, offices, kitchens, carriage yards, and church errands, could have become a messenger in ways the Whitlocks never understood. She could listen while pretending not to listen, read over shoulders, memorize names, notice who came to visit, notice which roads were used at night, notice which neighbors might be vulnerable or sympathetic, or both. The more Rebecca thought about it, the more the paper in Lydia's hand stopped looking like a random note and started looking like evidence. She followed the sale trail south. Records in Louisiana showed that in November 1858, 3 women matching the Whitlock transaction were sold to a sugar planter in Ascension Parish. One woman, estimated at about 32, was described in a notarial note as unusually literate and insolent. That language tells you a lot. Literate meant dangerous. Insolent often meant unwilling to submit quietly. 6 months later, parish records noted that one of the 3 women had escaped. No confirmed capture ever followed. That woman may have been Lydia, and this is where the story goes from dark to almost unbelievable. More than that, she had gone from enslaved domestic worker to fugitive to operative inside a liberation network, and somewhere along that path she had left behind a message in plain sight, hidden in the one place her enslavers would never bother to examine closely. Because why would they? The whole logic of slavery required them to believe the people they brutalized were incapable of that kind of planning, that kind of intelligence, that kind of audacity. That, to me, is the deepest part of this story. The photograph began as a trophy of hierarchy. It ended up becoming evidence against the hierarchy itself. When the image was finally exhibited with its new research, descendants came to see it. Some were descendants of the Whitlocks, forced to look directly at what their family's wealth had rested on. Others were descendants of people believed to have escaped from the Petersburg and Richmond area through wartime networks. One elderly man stood in front of the daguerreotype for a long time and quietly told Rebecca that his great-great-grandmother had passed down a story about a woman near Petersburg who carried freedom in her hand. That line nearly broke her. And honestly, it gets me too, because that is exactly what this image may show. Not metaphorically, literally. Freedom in her hand, folded small enough to hide, important enough to risk everything for. Today, the plate is no longer displayed as a plantation family portrait in the old familiar sense. Nobody cares about Daniel Whitlock's jacket or Caroline's posture, or the children arranged like proof of gentility. The eye goes where it should have gone all along. To Lydia, to the hand, to the piece of paper half hidden in the shadows. And once you see it, the whole picture changes. The enslaver is no longer the center of the story. He only thought he was. The real center has been standing there the whole time, holding a secret, looking out from the edge of the frame with the kind of calm that only makes sense once you realize she may already have been fighting back. But here's the part that lingers after everything else. If Lydia was bold enough to place a coded map in a formal photograph in 1858, knowing that discovery could get her sold, whipped, or killed, then this may not have been a one-time act. It may have been a method, a way of using portraits, papers, and the blindness of powerful people against them, which means somewhere, in some other archive box or family trunk or forgotten case, there may be another image, another face, another hand holding something the camera was never supposed to reveal. And the question now is not whether Lydia left a message. The question is, how many others did too? And how many of those messages are still waiting, silent and patient, for somebody to finally look close enough to see them?